Today's lecture is on debate within modern Islam concerning the roles of women. We've already looked at the life of Muhammad and his involvement with women, starting with his first wife, Khadija, and his most famous wife, Aisha. We've looked at women's passages relating to women in the Quran. We've looked at later Muslim texts, the Sunnah, the Hadith, various forms of commentary and interpretation called tafsir, and then the compilation of these into a body of law known as the Sharia, and formulated and kind of defined in a final way in the 12th century. So today we're going to be jumping from the 12th century to the 20th and 21st centuries. A big jump. To know more about women in Islam, there are many universities that offer a full course in women in Islam. Here at CSUN, Naira Tohidi, the chair of the Gender and Women's Studies Department, offers a course this semester actually in women in Islam. But we'll do our survey of the issues in this course, and today we'll be looking at the 20th and 21st centuries, the debate surrounding women's roles. This debate is paralleled within Christianity, a very vocal debate over whether women should be allowed to be priests, to have full equality in the church and in the home or not, and the similar debate within Judaism. So even though the three main branches of Judaism allow women to be rabbis, we still have Orthodox Jews who say that women are very different and have different roles, including not having a full status of rabbi open to them, although we do have so far one woman ordained to be sort of a female rabbi with a different title, but all the same responsibilities. So even the Orthodox within Judaism are making progress on this issue from the point of view of the progressive women. But let's look at women's the debate concerning women within Islam. It's probably obvious to everyone today that there is one group within one end of the spectrum within Islam that is advocating separate roles and restricted roles for women. We hear a lot about that. Definitely that would include the Taliban in Afghanistan and conservative Muslims in various parts of the world. Here are some things that we hear in the news. We hear about women being beaten if they don't agree to an arranged marriage, a flogging incident in Swat in 2009, where women in Pakistan held large rallies protesting the flogging of a girl. We hear a lot about female circumcision within various Muslim cultures. So we have a tendency to say all Muslim women and then fill in the blank are oppressed, face restrictions culturally, such as female genital mutilation, known as FGM, or all women have to wear the veil. And those are misconceptions. Anything that begins with all Muslim women is likely to be a misconception. Muslim women's rights vary from country to country. Turkey is probably the most progressive country in which women have most of all the same rights of any European country. There are more conservative countries such as Somalia, definitely currently Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, where you do have limited rights for women within the political sphere, within the home. But you also will notice that even within any one country, conditions vary greatly from the countryside and the rural areas to the city. So what we're dealing with when we look at women in Islam is two factors. One is the cultural norms for women, which existed prior to the life of Muhammad and persist today. So ideas that the man should have complete control and dominance over the woman, that the man owns the children, that that women's sexuality has to be very largely circumscribed, controlled in order to protect the honor of the family. These aren't really ideas within Islam. They're ideas within Middle Eastern countries, and now that Islam has spread, within other countries that have picked up cultural ideas and spread them as being part of Islam, when in fact, if you look in the Quran, you don't find any backing for these things. You do find within Sharia law quite a few restrictions on women, but as we discussed in a previous lecture, Sharia law was codified in the 12th century, in the 1100s, 400 years after the life of Muhammad. And during that 400 years, there was a lot of debate on the role of women. Shortly after the death of Muhammad, his wife Aisha had a very powerful role within Islam, interpreting her husband's statements and his leadership and passing it on to the people around her. And so for the next 200 years, his statements and ideas were written down, collectively known as the Sunnah, his actions and practices, and the Haditha, his sayings. And then these were culled and sorted into which were probably true and which were legend. And then for 200 years after that, there were schools of legal decisions on how all of the Quran and the Sunnah and the Hadith and the interpretations already written should be compiled into a law that could be a useful law for a Muslim country in which the legal system there was no separation of church and state. There was, in fact, a combined rule. So how do we have laws that reflect our religion? So that's what the Sharia was. And that's what it was set as in the 12th century, and with a decision, we're not going to argue about this anymore. We're just going to accept this from now on. Now, they weren't thinking of the next 1,000 years up to the 21st century. So the main point about women in Islam is that the stereotypes are exactly that. They're stereotypes, and we have to look at each country. We have to look at each century. We have to look at each writing and each group of women within the 20th century and the 21st centuries, and find out what different women within Islam have thought about interpretation of the Quran, about how to understand Sharia law in the 21st century. At this point, I'd like to point out that there are a number of Muslim women's organizations, and many of them are progressive, and I'll just mention a few that have websites that are available. One is the Muslim Women's League, and it's at mwlusa.org, and it presents definitely a strong stand in favor of gender equality, and it has documents and papers and events that help Muslim women to understand that within the Quran there is equality for women and that there should be in Muslim societies. Another is the International Union of Muslim Women, and I don't know their website address. At this point that I got it, it was still under construction. But you could reach them at uimw@liveislam.org. There's another website called Live Islam. And another website I'll just mention is called islamfortoday.com. And it also speaks to women's rights within Islam, has websites by Muslim women that it has links to, and discusses issues such as the hijab, which is the veil, the covering, and another widespread misconception about polygamy. Oh, in Islam, a man can have 4 husbands. Well, as we discussed in a previous lecture, the conditions under which the Quran allows 4 husbands have a lot to do with conditions in the 7th century and orphans and women who are widows and who need an economic basis and a place within society. And under those conditions, Muhammad said, yes, you can have up to 4 wives when you're trying to provide for an orphan or someone. But actually, it's very important to note that Muhammad was limiting marriage to 4 in that century. He wasn't going from a situation where where marriage was a 1-to-1 relationship and expanding it to 4. He was trying to control the widespread practice of multiple wives and trying to say, and I shouldn't say he was trying to do that. God, in God's revelation through the Quran, was giving Muhammad the directive that 4 wives were possible in a condition of need. But in most cultures in the world today, that same urgent need to provide for a woman doesn't exist, because in many parts of the world today, a woman can get a job, a woman can provide for herself, even if she's widowed or is an orphan or just growing up and needing a way to survive. She can probably take care of herself. Not true in all cultures and in all places, definitely. So these are important organizations to know about. Another important way to work on the stereotypes is to notice the different countries, and to notice that when we hear about things like honor killings and female genital mutilation, that these have a lot to do with ancient cultures and rural areas enforcing ideas that are not within the Quran. So let's look now at the issue of the veil within Islam, because that's a widespread idea that women have to wear the veil, or definitely in Iran that women have to wear a full covering head to toe, a burqa. So we've noted in a previous lecture that within the Quran there are only a couple of statements about modesty and covering, and the one that we noticed the other day on modesty speaks both to men and to women to lower their gaze and guard their modesty. It says for women that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except within the family. Here's another passage that is sometimes cited as a passage where requiring women to wear the veil, but all interpreters note that this particular passage is a message from God to Muhammad in regard to his own wives and daughters. So the passage is in Surah 33, verse 59 and 60, and it says, O Prophet, tell thy wives and daughters and the believing women that they should cast their outer garments over their persons when abroad. That is most convenient, that they should be known as such. This is Muhammad's family, and not molested. And Allah is oft forgiving, oft most merciful. So, so what occurred in the 7th century in regard to veils was that veiling was only available to upper class women. Your average woman who is in the marketplace, in the fields, working and laboring, wasn't going to be wearing a veil. It was a status symbol, and this was true within many cultures, within many religions in the world of Mecca and Medina, and the whole Middle Eastern world, the Mediterranean, that it was a status thing to be able to have a veil, and a beautiful veil, and to guard your modesty, and that wasn't available to everybody. So when Muhammad, later in his life, when he adopted the practice of wearing the veil as instructed through the messages that he got from God, it was to protect his family and to protect his honor, to have his family observe the high status practice of wearing veils, and to be protected from the general public, kind of like in the 21st century dealing with paparazzi. So this was a way of gaining respect and status. But later, actually very shortly within Islam, other women adopted it. It was the thing to do, like having the right handbag, by the right maker, by the right manufacturer, and other people adopted it. So it became a widespread practice. Then within the 20th century, we have another political factor coming into the choice to wear the veil. So especially in North Africa, when France controlled Algeria, France viewed the veil as a cultural behavior and a sign of Muslim religion that they wanted to have women give up, and they wanted women to not wear the veil in order to show that they were a French country, Algeria was a French country, and that they should adopt French and Western practices. So we have the colonial idea that the veil should not be worn. And when you have a political system from the West saying don't wear the veil, then suddenly wearing the veil becomes no longer the woman's own choice. It becomes a symbol of her family's allegiance politically and of her nationalism, and it's not just her own choice. Am I going to be a really observant Muslim woman, or am I going to not be so dramatically in line with historical customs and practice? So here's a quote from a man named Frantz Fanon, who wrote a book analyzing the whole Algerian and French war and the use of the veil within that context. And he says, to the colonial offensive against the veil, the colonized opposes the cult of the veil. So they establish the cult of the veil, or the extreme value of veiling, in opposition to the colonial power saying you have to not wear the veil. So then the oppressed culture and family says you have to wear the veil. So as feminists have commented, the woman's body then becomes the site of a battleground over politics. Whether she wears or doesn't wear the veil is not so much her choice as her family's political statement. So this is where women can in some cultures lose the choice, their own personal choice over how observant they want to be. We have this debate still happening today within France and within places like Turkey. Turkey, for a while, has had a ban on headscarves because they don't want to have everyone required to wear headscarves, so they say no one can wear headscarves. Once again, the battlefield being the woman's body and the woman's clothing. So here's a headline from 2008. Move to lift a ban on headscarves, gains in Turkey. Then we have, actually, by the year 2011, the ban on headscarves voted out in Turkey. So in Turkey now it is possible to choose to wear the hijab, the headscarf and shoulder and bust protective ornament or scarf, or not to wear it. What women in Turkey, progressive women, are nervous about is the pendulum continuing to swing to the point where wearing the hijab would be required. So this is a political debate, and it's being waged on the issue of the clothing of women. Similar debates are happening in Egypt and in France. So last year in 2011, in April, the French government had earlier passed a law saying that if a woman was shopping and wearing a veil, she could be fined. In other words, it's such a political statement to wear a veil that France isn't allowing women to wear veils in public. So this article says France is the first country in Europe to publicly ban the Muslim face veil, and this is the actual complete veiling with just the eyes. Anyone can have a lighter scarf over their head. But Here's another article saying that there's a quiet end to Turkey's ban on headscarves, and even in colleges, there's an end to that ban. So this is an issue that continues to be debated within the world, but within the Quran, it's for Muslims who want to be modest and observant, both men and women, to dress modestly. So the man can't have bare-chested, dramatically sexy look. Neither can the woman have a profile that's suggestive or low-cut or whatever. And then for the other thing to remember, that in the Quran, it's primarily Muhammad's wives and daughters that are having this veil as a protection from the public and as a status symbol for respect for the Prophet and his family. That has been adopted widespread later, has been custom, and then in the 20th century and 21st century has become a political issue. And certainly in Iran today, when the Taliban wants to assert its power, it says women will be covered head to toe. If you have a bit of ankle showing, you can be arrested or kidnapped and put in jail, and you have to be veiled to the extent of only your eyes showing. So this is a debate, but we can't say anything like all women have to wear the veil or are oppressed, because it varies from country to country, and it's not within the Quran and Islam per se, it's within the culture. So those are points to notice. Let's go on and look at women a little bit, just a few names from women in Muslim history from the 12th century to the 21st, because even though there are people today, especially in countries like Iran, who don't want women to have education and to have equal status within the political and public sphere, there have been female Muslim scholars and female leaders throughout the previous 1,000 years of history, and certainly since the 12th century, 11th century, and certainly in the first few centuries during Muhammad's lifetime and in the first few centuries after his lifetime. So there are lists of female scholars that are known in history. They're known as Muslimas, Hadith scholars, and I'll just name a few of them: Fatima al-Fudaliya, Juma bint Ahmad, Dun al-Waz, Abda bint Khalid ibn Safwan, and perhaps the most famous name, Aisha bint Muhammad ibn Abdil Hadi. So we'll talk a little bit about her. She's an 11th century student of the law and scholar. And let me find my notes about her. Let's see. At any rate, she's a poet. She argued cases within the law. I believe she's living in Egypt. And anyway, she's an amazing instance, and she's almost 1,000 years ago. So she gave legal opinions. She did important writings, and she's not widely known today. There are also female sheikhs, and throughout history you can find here and there different female sheikhs, which you can find by researching on Google or going to some of your online sources. When we get to the 20th century, we start to have some very important names, and one of them is Aisha Abdul Rahman. Her dates are 1913 to 1998. She was Egypt's leading female Islamic writer and scholar. She was a human rights and women's rights advocate, but she was completely an observant Muslim woman, and she was a scholar of Islamic philosophy. She wrote 40 books on the history and structure of Islamic scripture, on literary criticism. Some of them, she also wrote a dozen novels and short stories, anthologies of short stories, and many research papers, and even a daily newspaper column. So she was a columnist and a scholar and a writer. And in the early part of the 20th century in Egypt, there was a feminist movement that reached its political peak in 1919, when there was a revolution against the British military presence in Egypt and against Ottoman influence. So it's important to know that just as there's a second wave within United States feminist movements, there's a second wave in Egypt today, and the first wave was the early part of the 20th century, and she was part of it. Let's see, the next important name we need to know is Leila Ahmad, who was born in 1940, and this is her most famous book, Women and Gender in Islam. So she's a scholar and a historian, and she looks at the rise of women within Islam and discourses about the veil and various kinds of social change, and just an excellent scholar which will dispel all stereotypes about women in Islam, because there are scholars like her that are working on these issues. Here's another book about social change within Islam, and this is more current. Her book, I believe, is probably around 20 years old. It's 1992, published by Yale University. Here's another book called Islam, Gender and Social Change, and it's a collection of essays edited by Yvonne Haddad and John Esposito. So there's definitely social change happening today, and these are different articles analyzing different conditions in different countries, and political factors, and modernism, and East-West relations, and different countries such as the Philippines, Indonesia. Conditions in various countries are all addressed. The most important names that we need to know today for this course are, besides Leila Ahmed, very important, let's look at three names. Asma Barlas, Amina Wadud, and Irshad Manji. So let's just take them as examples of progressive feminist women within Islam. So first, let's look at Asma Barlas. She's the author of this book, Believing Women in Islam, and its subtitle is Unreading Patriarchal Interpretations of the Quran. So she goes through very carefully a study of the Quran, and to look at different texts that have to do with women and issues relating to women's rights. And she looks at the different balance of influence of other Muslim texts, such as the Haditha, the Sunnah, and the commentary known as tafsir. So she notices all of these influential forces within decision-making influences within Islam. So she begins one chapter with the statement, how do people within Islam make decisions about how they should live? And she points out that there are these, in fact, I'll just read her quote. She says, we want to understand how Muslims produce religious meaning. So she says, in order to understand this, how they get meaning, how they interpret the various cultural and Quranic and other textual influences for their own lives, their own decisions. So she says, in order to discover how a particular Muslim person decides how to live their life, we need to know something about the various primary texts. So she has a chart showing the Quran in the middle, the Sunnah, the Ahadith, the Tafsir, and Sharia law as four other factors surrounding the Quran. And one of her main points in this book is that the Quran is not as heavily weighted in a lot of situations as modern women would like it to be. What takes greater weight often is the commentary on the Quran, or the Sunnah, the practices of Muhammad in the 7th century, his actual dealings with people as recorded in little anecdotes. So she says it would be better for women if we just really looked at the Quran than if we relied so heavily on the patriarchal interpretations of the Quran. So, Asma Barlas, a very influential voice among Muslim women today. Another interesting voice is Amina Wadud, and here is one of her books, Quran and Woman, Rereading the Sacred Text from a Woman's Perspective. Amina Wadud is actually an African American whose father was a pastor who converted to Islam in her college years. She's a scholar of the Quran, and she's very well known today. One of the things that she's most well known for is her decision in 2005 to hold a worship service for both men and women, and with herself as the leader of the worship service. So this was pretty radical because it hadn't been done that we know of prior to that. So women were allowed to lead worship services with women, and men were allowed to lead, and still are allowed to lead, worship services for a mixed group of men and women. Although traditionally the men would sit in the front and the women in the back, or behind a wall, or perhaps even in a separate room. In 2005, however, she announced, and her supporters working with her announced that she was going to lead a mixed congregational prayer in New York City, which was actually held in a Christian church. And when this announcement was made, she got a lot of backlash. She got threats to her life, and some of the mosques where she would have held it refused to host the prayer service. So it ended up being in the Cathedral Church of St. John in New York City. But she went ahead and held the prayer service, and in the days after it, she got a lot of negative feedback from various Muslim institutions. For example, the Sunni Muslim institution in Egypt issued a condemnation, and she was accused of trying to corrupt the community. So that was a famous act, and since 2005 there haven't been a lot of people following her, but that was a courageous step. She continues to be an important voice, speaking for women's rights and studying the Quran and doing modern interpretation of the rights and roles of women based primarily on the Quran and less on the cultural influences, such as the Sharia. So actually it's a debate within, one of the debates within women in Islam in the 21st century is, can we modify the Sharia, which in the 12th century closed off 200 years of debate by saying, okay, we're all going to agree on this and we're not going to debate it anymore. Well, if they could have imagined that there would be a very different world and culture 1,000 years later that might have wanted to modify it, maybe they wouldn't have cut it off quite so emphatically. But there are women today who are, and men, who are arguing that Sharia law in some details is not appropriate for the 21st century. So now I'll just list the names of some prominent men who are scholars on this subject of reform within Islam. So some of the most well-known scholars are Farid Esak, who wrote a book of interpretation called the Quran. He talks about how it was first revealed to Muhammad, how it was written down, how the different sections, each revealed in a different time, a different month, or over a period of 20 years, were gathered together, how it's been understood and interpreted since then. So he's an important scholar who's working on these issues along with the women. Here's another scholar, Fazlur Rahman, and one of his books is called Major Themes of the Quran. And so one of his points in this book is we need to look at the important major themes and honor them and honor the overall direction that the Quran was going in when it was revealed in the 7th century, and not try to pick out little verses that we want to enforce today that are actually more cultural and time-bound. We should look at the untime-bound, larger themes. Here's another commentator, Saeed Hossein Nasr, The Heart of Islam, Enduring Values for Humanity. And here's another well-known commentator, Abdullah Saeed, Interpreting the Quran, Toward a Contemporary Approach. So each of these men has a different particular take on how to look at the Quran and how to reinterpret the Sharia for today. But I would say as a whole that they agree that there is a need for more understanding of how it can be applied to Muslims' lives today, and less just taking for granted that customs and laws in the 7th century, such as cut off the hand of a thief or stone someone for adultery, that these no longer really should be enforced in the way that they were understood in the 7th century. And I will just comment that this is also true for Christians and for Jews. So we all have these ancient texts that say things like, if your son disobeys you, you can kill your son, and that you should stone someone who commits adultery, or in fact that's another lecture. But these ancient traditions, ancient scriptures, and how to apply them today are debated within all three religions. Okay, let's look at a couple of other important women within Islam. Here's another book by Amina Wadud called Inside the Gender Jihad, Women's Reform in Islam. So she's actually using the term jihad to describe the gender politics between women and men in Islam today. Jihad actually means struggle. It can be a spiritual struggle. So a person's struggle on how to really live out service to God and respect for God within the world. Struggle with your own self to do the right thing. It's popularly known as in the 9/11 2001 event, the word jihad was used to describe a struggle between radical Islam trying to impact or conquer or hurt the Western world, particularly the U.S. and New York City and the World Trade Center. But that form of jihad as a military struggle is only one of the meanings, and it's not the primary meaning within the Quran. So she describes gender politics as a jihad inside Islam today. Amina Wadud. Here's another book to just point out the difference between what one group says and what the debate within the entire Muslim community. And this book is called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And this is written by John Esposito and Dalia Mogahed. So this, even the title just points out that Muslims are almost a quarter of, I think about a quarter of the world's population today, and that anyone who says what they really think is overgeneralizing. But the question is, who speaks for Islam? Are we going to listen to what the Taliban says and say, oh, well, Islam is so weird or so conservative or so radical? Well, we wouldn't do that for Christianity, would we? We wouldn't say that what the Southern Baptist denomination that doesn't currently allow women to be priests, we wouldn't say that that represents all of Christianity, or we wouldn't say that the Pope represents all of Christianity. There are many groups of Christians that have women pastors and full women's equality within them. So, who speaks for Islam is a question. And I'll just mention a couple of other books. This one is called Opening the Gates, A Century of Arab Feminist Writing. So, like the book by Gerda Lerner called Women's Consciousness, how feminist consciousness developed over the centuries, over actually more than 1,000 years. This book points out that there's been a whole century of feminist women within Arab cultures, Arab and primarily Muslim cultures, discussing women's rights and how to get better equality for women within the Muslim world. Here's another one called The Price of Honor. Muslim Women Lift the Veil of Silence on the Islamic World by Jan Goodwin. So it's how Muslim women have been affected by the modern rise of fundamentalism and how women are fighting against that rise of fundamentalism. Another important name to know about is Nawal el-Saadawi. And she's an important leader in Egypt right now, and she's been a leader for most of her 85 years in Egypt. She's a doctor, so one of the books she wrote is Memoirs of a Woman Doctor. Her most famous book is Woman at Point Zero. This is a fictionalized version of an account of the life of a woman who Nawal el-Saadawi interviewed when she was interviewing women in prisons and helping women as a doctor earlier. This book was written, I believe, about 20 years ago. Yes, it was written in 1975, so that's really almost 40 years ago. Her most famous book. The woman in this story is in a prison, and she's not afraid to die, and she has been told that her death sentence can be lifted if she will just agree to it and say thank you, but she is proudly saying no. I've been mistreated my whole life, and I prefer to go ahead and die rather than take any crumb tossed to me by an unjust legal system. So it's based on a true story, and it's Nawal el-Saadawi's most famous depiction of the plight of women in Egypt in particular. This is a woman who starts out as a poor child, discriminated against in her family. She's forced into an unfair marriage with an older man. She then escapes from that, becomes a prostitute, and has a series of other events before she kills one of her abusers and then ends up in prison and is interviewed by Dr. Saadawi. Here's another book by Nawal called The Hidden Face of Eve, Women in the Arab World. And here's a book about her by Fedwa Malti Douglas called Men, Women, and Gods, whichever way you want to think about it. Nawal el-Saadawi and Arab Feminist Politics. So there's so much happening for women in the Muslim world today. There's different countries, gender conflicts, issues, and there's a lot to know about. I will now raise a few other names because there are some other important women to know about. One is Rifat Hassan. She's an author, professor, and leading spokeswoman for Muslim feminists today. She taught at the University of Louisville in Kentucky for many years. I believe she might be retired now. She was a scholar of a poet, I believe a Pakistani poet. And then she was asked to speak, to give a women's point of view about 30 years ago at a conference. And she thought, why would I want to talk about the woman's point of view? I'm interested in literature and in political and philosophical issues, but I'm not going to just speak for all women or look at women's issues. But she took the opportunity, she took the challenge to do that. And she started looking at the Quran and looking at all the women's issues, and she decided that that she should become a spokesperson for women in Islam, because practices within parts of the Muslim world today were so far from what's actually outlined in the Quran. So she became an important spokeswoman. Another interesting person to know about is Irshad Manji. She's a Canadian feminist and journalist. She's author of a book called The Trouble with Islam Today. She's now working at New York University. She keeps a blog. She's a mother. She identifies as a lesbian. And one of the most interesting things about her is that she has made available on her website a newer translation of the Quran called, the Quran can't actually be translated, it's just the meaning that can be translated. So that's a distinction that Muslims make, that any translation of the Quran is actually identified as the meaning of the Holy Quran that has been translated, because the words themselves are too holy and can't completely be translated. But she has on her website a Quran which, in passages where it says man and really means mankind, the language is changed to reflect men and women, and in various other ways, just by simple translation details, the Quran is much more receptive and inclusive of women. So you can access that by going to her website, and her website is irshadmanji.com, so irshadmanji.com. And you can download a copy of this reformist interpretation of the Quran. So she's an interesting voice. It's important to know that there are lesbians women within Islam. So good to know about her. Other names that give us another perspective on women in Islam. Shireen Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2003, the Iranian lawyer who has courageously stood up to her government and defended human rights under extremely difficult conditions. She now has a memoir out, so to read her memoir would help to dispel any stereotypes about how oppressed women are within Islam, because she was allowed to get an education, and prior to the revolution in Iran in 1978, she had much more equality and freedom, and she has continued to fight for it since then. Another interesting name is Benazir Bhutto, who twice served as prime minister in Pakistan and was assassinated in 2007 in December while running for office again. So another major leader within Pakistan. Another important person to know about is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's Somali by birth. She experienced female genital mutilation as a child. She was allowed to go to school in England, and I believe she was, no, actually, I'm sorry, that might be a different person. But she was about to be forced into an unfair marriage when to a person she hadn't met, a cousin, an older man, and she managed to escape, and she fled to the Netherlands. There she started supporting herself, working as a translator in different courtrooms, and then she became interested in the legal practice and in law, and ran for office and became a member of the lower house in the Netherlands. She became an activist against FGM, female genital mutilation, and against other oppressive practices in some Islamic cultures. She actually is now an ex-Muslim. She identifies as an atheist, and she has a lot of issues with the religion in which she was raised, the fundamentalist kind of Islamic faith. In her fight against these oppressive practices that she experienced in Somalia, she was making a film called Submission, and the filmmaker was Theo van Gogh, I think a grandnephew of Vincent van Gogh. He was killed by right-wing Muslims who did not like him making a film that they felt was a defamation of the Muslim faith. So she at one point had to flee for her life to the United States, so she's no longer living in the Netherlands. But she's continuing to write about her life and her journey. One of her most recent books is titled Infidel. So she's an interesting spokesperson for a woman who has left the Muslim faith, kind of parallel perhaps to someone like Mary Daly, who is an ex-Catholic. So important to know about those people. I'll mention a couple of other names. Marjan Satrapi. She grew up in Iran. She was about maybe 8 or 10 years old at the time of the revolution, the Taliban takeover in 1978. And she has written graphic novels describing her own life journey growing up in Tehran. Those novels were subsequently made into a film with similar graphic it's not a person, it's simply cartoons and a graphic film, Persepolis, that came out in 2007. So by watching that film, you can get more of an idea about her experience as a woman within Islam. Another name to mention here at CSUN especially is Esha Momeni. She was a grad student here who was making a documentary about women working to improve conditions for women in Iran today. She had grown up partly in Iran and partly here, and she went back to her country in about, I believe, 2009 to film parts of this documentary. And the whole point of the documentary was going to be the progress that women have made as of the year 2009, 2010, and the courageous struggle of women in Iran to achieve full equality and achieve their rights, even within a system governed by the Taliban. But when she was there filming, she didn't realize that simply doing any kind of filming would be threatening to the government. So she was arrested and she was imprisoned. She was imprisoned for a little over a year, and she was finally released in 2010. And there was a big movement here on the CSUN campus to support her and to try to write letters and get her release. So she's an interesting person to know about. And along with her, I'll just mention that there are many books on Muslim women in America and what immigrants have, the adjustments that they've made and the contributions that they've made to the American culture today. So this is called Muslim Women in America, The Challenge of Islamic Identity Today. and it's edited by Yvonne Haddad, Jane Smith, and Kathleen Moore. Especially since the year 2001. Of course, it's been very difficult to be a Muslim woman in the U.S. or a Muslim man, but particularly to have clothing that visibly identifies you as a Muslim woman. In fact, we have a case recently, earlier this year in 2012, of a woman in San Diego who was shot and killed, and a little note was there was a threatening note a few days ahead of time, and a threatening note left on her body saying, "You're a terrorist, go back to your own country." So why did they think she was a terrorist? Because she wore a veil. So it takes a lot of courage in the U.S. today and in many cultures to publicly identify as a Muslim, and women are doing that. So those are some of the names and some of the issues that will give you, I hope, a new perspective or just a sense of the incredible diversity and the courageous struggle for human rights within the world of Islam and within the world of gender politics today. Thank you.